This week on Let's Talk About Mental Health, I'm talking about managing your recovery from mental health challenges. So let's get talking. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being, hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello and welcome to episode 27 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the weekly podcast about improving your mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin. Thank you for joining me. This week I'm talking about recovery. I'll be discussing the ups and downs of the process of recovering from mental health challenges and looking at different things that you can do to manage your own long-term recovery. So let's talk. Well, after covering quite a few difficult topics over the past few episodes, I'm actually pretty excited to talk about this week's subject, recovery, because even though it's still a challenging one, I think it's also a really optimistic topic to be talking about. Because the idea of recovery is all about the fact that things can and do get better when it comes to mental health issues, with effort and time and patience. Let me begin by saying that recovery is absolutely possible. So for anyone listening who might be dealing with mental illness, let me say again that it can get better and it does get better. It won't just happen overnight and it won't be easy. It might mean a full recovery or learning to manage your symptoms while increasing your quality of life over time, but recovery is entirely possible. To quote an organisation here in Australia called SANE, most people with a mental illness recover well with appropriate ongoing treatment and support, and I'll put the reference for that in the transcript on the website. Recovery is entirely personal. What it looks and feels like for you will be unique to you because you are unique. Later on in this episode, I'm going to talk you through how you can build a plan to manage your own recovery. However, first, let me take a few minutes to define recovery and talk about some aspects of it that you need to be aware of. So, what is recovery when we're talking about mental health? According to Health Direct Australia, mental health recovery is not the same as a cure. Recovery means being able to create and live a meaningful life and contribute to your community, with or without mental health issues. Recovery is about all of your life, not just your symptoms. It involves finding hope and developing self-esteem and resilience, having a sense of purpose and meaning in your life, building healthy relationships, and gaining independence. And I'll include the reference for that in the transcript on the website. I shared that definition because I think it's an excellent overview of what recovery is about, because it covers the whole of your life. And since mental illness affects pretty much every aspect of your life, if not every aspect, what that definition illustrates is that any plan for recovery needs to factor in much more than just dealing with your symptoms. Recovery is a journey, not a destination. Now, I know that expression gets thrown around a lot and it can be a bit of an overused cliche, but when it comes to recovery, I think it's the best way of describing the experience. Recovery doesn't just happen in a straight line, nor does it just happen overnight or by popping a pill. It takes time, and there will be ups and downs along the way. Recovery can quite often be like a roller coaster, and often it takes a lot longer than we expect it to, so we're forced to take things one step at a time, and to look at what we're learning along the way so that we can change what we need to change, which can quite often mean changing the direction that we're heading in. And of course that means that your destination might end up being entirely different from where you thought that you were headed towards when all this began. And sometimes our journey of recovery will guide us in totally different directions, and it can be a catalyst for major changes in our lives. So even though mental illness can be awful to experience, it can also serve to be a force for good in our lives. I think when we're talking about recovery, just like what's going on at the moment with COVID-19, there might be a rush to want to go back to normal. But in many cases, that's not possible or even ideal. If normal wasn't working before, then your experiences might be a sign that things need to change. If you rush back to the way that things were, you will have lost the lessons that you've learned along the way. Again, recovery is a journey rather than just being about reaching a specific destination. I think it's more of a case of growing into something new, because mental health issues can force us to think about what's really important in our lives and to consider what needs to change. For me, I found my own experiences to be an awakening because it made me re-examine every part of my life, change that I'm enormously grateful for now, all of these years later. At first I tried to go back to the life that I led before my breakdown, and it just didn't fit anymore. And so over time, I've made massive changes. Like I said, I've moved from the city to the country. I work for myself. I've reviewed the relationships that I have with friends and family. And most importantly, I've changed my priorities to better reflect what is genuinely important to me. My new normal looks 1,000 times different to what my life looked like nearly 9 years ago when all of this started, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The thing about recovery is it takes time and it takes work. It requires you to look at your overall health, mental, physical, and spiritual, because everything is connected. It challenges you to be brave and to take action, even when it's the last thing in the world that you might want to do, and even when making changes can cause even more challenges. For example, letting go of relationships that no longer serve your well-being can really hurt, but sometimes that's what you have to do. Just like a recovering alcoholic might find it difficult to be in a bar or simply be around people who are drinking, someone recovering from mental illness might need to think about the situations that they're putting themselves in and to make adjustments where necessary. Recovery is not all rainbows and unicorns. Recovery is hard work, but it's totally worth it, especially when you start to see progress over time. And with that in mind, let's talk about specific things that you can do to manage your mental health recovery. I'm going to start with some general things to be aware of relating to recovery, and then I'll talk through 3 main steps to creating your own recovery plan. So the first is the importance of daily action. Now, baby steps are totally fine and encouraged when it comes to mental health recovery. And sometimes maybe the best that you can manage, especially in the early stages of recovery, is to simply get out of bed or have a shower. And if that's the best that you can manage, it's still progress, especially if it's something that you haven't been able to do. When I was stuck in the worst of my own depression and anxiety, and when even leaving the house became a struggle, I'd only be able to go to collect the mail from the letterbox at the end of the driveway once a week when I took the bins out, because I knew I had no choice by that point, otherwise I'd end up being swamped by rubbish. Anyway, so that was once a week that I was able to bring myself to leave the house. Now, I worked my way up to an extra day of going out to get the mail. And then I brought that to 3 days and 4 days and so on and so forth, until I was doing it every single day. And eventually I was then able to start making more trips out of the house and to start going back out in public. And that would have been almost impossible without those initial baby steps. Any action, no matter how small it might seem, is a step in the right direction. Now, when you're thinking about recovery, I like to encourage anyone to think about what are your strengths so that you can then build on those. So ask yourself, what are you good at? Identify that and do more of that. Why do I say that? Well, because accomplishing things will make you feel positive, and it will help you to accomplish more things. If you want to build your skills to do particular things that you're interested in, then go and find courses or have someone show you how to do it. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that success breeds success. So really leverage on your strengths and the things that you're passionate about. Now, on the flip side of that, identify your challenges and deal with them, one by one and with support. So for example, if you have unresolved relationship issues with a family member or friend, identify how you can modify the situation. Remember, I've said in previous episodes, you cannot change another person. All that you have direct control over are your words, actions, and feelings. But if a relationship is causing you a lot of issues, something needs to happen. So that's something to consider. Now, you don't need to do that alone. You can, of course, and should, of course, get support. And speaking of support, my next piece of advice when it comes to recovery is support, 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 and then more support. When it comes to recovery, it takes a village, people. There's a reason why I always remind you to seek support in pretty much every episode, such as working with a therapist or a counsellor. And that's because, let me quote Sane Australia here, most people with a mental illness recover well with appropriate ongoing treatment and support. You'll find the link for that in the transcript. And here's another quote for you to consider. The UK's Mental Health Foundation says, "The recovery journey benefits from a well-organised system of support, which includes the individual themselves, family, friends, professionals, health services, and wider communities." So when it comes to recovery, you don't need to go it alone, and nor should you. You can find lots of support, either in person or online. And the one thing that's come out of COVID-19 is that you can now find many more therapists and counsellors who are offering sessions via video, which is brilliant, especially if you find it hard to get to treatment, or perhaps you live in a rural or regional area. So whatever works for you, build your support network and lean on that support network. Now, my next piece of general advice about recovery is specific to medication, and it is to consider long-term plans for your medication if applicable. Now, if you are taking medication as part of your treatment, you may decide to review that with your doctor regularly. So you might do it, say, once a year or twice a year, with the view to working towards a life without medication, if that is an option for you or if it feels right for you. Doesn't mean you have to. The reason why I bring this up is because I want to give a very strong warning here, which is never go off your medication without consulting a doctor. You might need to wean yourself off over a prolonged period of time, and while you're doing so, your condition has to be monitored closely to ensure that you don't experience any adverse effects of withdrawal or a worsening of symptoms associated with your condition. I was on anti-anxiety and antidepressant meds, and I ended up working with my doctor for a full 3 years to wean myself off them. First, I came off the anti-anxiety meds, and then once I'd gotten through that and gotten settled, then we worked to get me off the antidepressants, and that took a lot longer, and that was a pretty rough journey, actually. When it comes to medication, do what feels right to you. But for some people, they might be comfortable taking medication, or it might be required to take medication for the rest of your life. For others, there may be an option to be able to come off it over time. And it's about having open lines of communication with your doctor and healthcare professionals and really thinking about what feels right to you. No matter what you do when it comes to medication, be consistent with taking it and never try to come off it or just stop taking it without working with your doctor. My next general point, and I kind of mentioned it briefly before, but I'm going to say it in more detail now, and it is plan for how you'll deal with setbacks. I mean, look, don't plan for disasters, positive thinking and all that, but also don't be naive and think that setbacks won't happen. Because life will always throw things your way that are out of your control. And when you're in any kind of recovery, setbacks can become triggers that might send you into a spiral or see you pursuing behavior that isn't good for you. Setbacks happen in life. We lose loved ones, or the world goes into meltdown when a pandemic happens, that type of thing. But it's up to each of us to work through setbacks so that they don't set us back in the long term. Now, speaking of setbacks, let's have an honest conversation about relapse. And when it comes to relapse, be alert, but not alarmed. Look, let's not sugarcoat this. When it comes to mental health, relapse can happen to some people. However, by having a recovery plan in place and working on your recovery every day proactively, both with support and on your own, you will be less likely to relapse. It's really important to monitor your condition regularly and to have regular checkups, either with your doctor or on your own, but preferably with your doctor. For example, if you're dealing with anxiety and or depression, then you might find it valuable to do the free Kessler Psychological Distress Scale, commonly known as the K10 test, just to give yourself a regular snapshot of how you're feeling. So I'll include a link in the transcript to the K10, but again, let me say that you shouldn't just be doing this sort of stuff on your own, especially in the earlier stages of your recovery, because your condition can deteriorate very quickly if it's not correctly diagnosed and managed by a professional. And I say this from personal experience. I went from breakdown to suicidal in just 2 weeks, so it can happen very rapidly for some people. So please, go see a doctor. Don't try to just treat yourself and expect that will resolve any issues you're facing, especially if your condition is deteriorating, because it just might make matters worse. So, monitor your ongoing condition regularly, and if it is starting to decline, go and seek professional help. Beyond that, when we talk about any kind of plan for anything in life, and this is no different when it comes to recovery, be prepared that you will make mistakes, and be okay with that. Nobody's perfect, and there's just no way to do this sort of challenging work without making a mistake or 10 along the way. As long as your intentions are to do no harm to others or to yourself, then treat mistakes as learning opportunities. I talked about this all the way back in episode 2 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, so have a listen to that or read it on the website at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes for more about dealing with mistakes. Now, on the flip side of mistakes, let's talk about progress, because it's really important to celebrate your progress along the way. We often get so caught up in what's next or what still needs to be done that we forget to recognize just how far we've come. So take the time to do that regularly. I talked about reflection in episode 12, and I'd encourage you to reflect, weekly or monthly, and really look at how far you've come on your journey. I saw a quote recently by an unknown author somewhere, I can't remember where, that said, "You might not be where you want to be, but neither are you where you used to be." And I think if any kind of progress is worthy of a celebration, then the progress that you make in your recovery certainly is. And finally, one day at a time. Who knew I'd drop this one in here? I know. I say this every single episode, and with good cause, because we tend to focus so much on chasing the big milestones in life, but that means that we're missing out on all the little things that happen every day, because life is actually a collection of the little moments. Be mindful. Make time every day to smell the roses, or savor a cup of coffee, or just stare up at the sky and watch the clouds pass by. The most important day of your life is today, because this moment right now is the only one that you have for sure. So why not make the most of it? Alright, let's talk through some specific steps to create a recovery plan that's tailored to your own unique set of circumstances. So first, work out your priorities. I've mentioned this a few times, and I encourage you to begin at the beginning by asking yourself, what really matters to you? And as part of that, why do you want to focus on your recovery? Be 100% clear on what's important to you, and let that inform everything that you do and say. Or don't say. I did an episode on priorities back in episode 3, and I'd encourage you to have a listen to that or read that for more details about priorities. You can find it at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes. But regardless, before you jump into any kind of action for your recovery, be really clear on what your priorities are first, because this will give you a much better understanding of why recovery is important to you and what you need to do to look after your priorities. So once you've done that, next, look at your whole life and consider what's working well so that you can do more of that, and what's not working so well so that you can then take action over time to change it. Now, you might find it very useful to get support here, because it can be challenging and even a bit confronting to take an objective look at your life, but it's worth it. According to the UK's Mental Health Foundation, important factors on the road to recovery include good relationships, satisfying work, personal growth, and the right living environment. And I'll put the link to that reference in the transcript. So take a look at where you're at now. And then once you've done that, you can move on to the third piece, which is about starting to develop a recovery plan. Now, again, you might want to do this with your doctor or therapist. And when I say might, that means you should, especially if you're still trying to get your symptoms under control. Or you can do it yourself with support if you can get support. Either way, a recovery plan should include things like, what are your goals? Be very specific. Should also include what might be holding you back or might be a potential barrier. And as part of that, consider how you might prevent or overcome those barriers and what support you can tap into. So that might range from basic support like your closest friends and relatives through to specific professional support for more difficult setbacks or barriers. Another piece to build into your plan is to think about what you can do to reach your goals and then translate that into what you will do. So what you can do is a bit of a brainstorming piece, and then once you've come up with a whole bunch of ideas, identify what you will do, which is your action plan. When you create actions, break it down into daily, weekly, and monthly actions that align back to the goals that you've set for yourself. But do so in bite-sized chunks. So, for example, there's a big difference between setting a goal to lose 20 kilos versus a daily goal to hit 10,000 steps. So some of the things that you might do might include a daily walk, or a weekly phone chat with 3 different people, or a fortnightly visit to a counsellor, etc., etc. Again, be really clear, be really specific about what those actions are that you will take. And then as part of that, also think about what actions will you take for your mental health, your physical health, and your spiritual health. Because again, they're all connected. Your total health will feed into your mental health. And that's something that I've discussed in past episodes as well. Also, when you're building a plan, what support will you need? So factor that into your plan. Consider how you will respond to any setbacks that might occur. For example, will you look for additional support from friends and family? Will you step up the number of counselling or therapy sessions if you then find yourself struggling with a major setback, etc.? So be really clear in your plan about what support you'll have, how frequently, and how that support will work. Don't just go, oh great, I'm getting support, without actually putting some thought to it. And then the other piece for your plan is how and when will you review your plan? So any kind of plan that you come up with, a recovery plan, whatever it is, always should be reviewed regularly, and do that either individually or with support, or preferably both. Now, to build a plan, there are lots of tools that you can use. You can either find one online that works for you, or you might just jot stuff down in your notes or on a piece of paper, whatever works best for you. I'll put in the transcript a link to a resource called WRAP, W-R-A-P, which is Wellness Recovery Action Plan. It's a resource which is, and I quote, a self-designed prevention and wellness tool that you can use to get well and stay well. And it's from mentalhealthrecovery.com. So I'll put the link in the transcript if you're interested in looking at that. Because when it comes to recovery, what it all boils down to is this. Recovery from mental illness is entirely possible. Even if you're currently struggling with your mental health and it feels like things might never improve, I'm here to tell you that they can improve and they will improve. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes perseverance. But things will get better. Healing and recovery require patience, and it requires you to be kind to yourself, to give yourself the time to heal, and to explore what your experiences have taught you about who you are and what you want. One day you will look back on all of this, and you'll be able to see that even though dealing with mental health challenges is confronting and confusing and scary, it's also a chance to rebuild your life, to focus more on the people and things that really matter to you. And that makes the recovery process less about recovering and much more about growing. To finish up, let me take a moment to share a quote about this week's topic that I'd like to encourage you to reflect on and consider what it means to you. This week's quote is by an unknown author, and it is, "We learn from experiences, both good and bad, and with that knowledge comes change and growth." Let me repeat that. We learn from experiences, both good and bad, and with that knowledge comes change and growth. Alright, that's it for this week's episode. Next week, I'll be talking about feelings. I've been talking for a while on Let's Talk About Mental Health about the fact that the only things in your direct control are your words, your actions, and your feelings. So next week, I'm talking about learning how to manage your feelings, even when it might seem completely and utterly impossible. I hope you'll join me for that episode, which will be released on Monday morning in Australia and New Zealand, Sunday evening in the UK and Ireland, and Sunday afternoon in the US and Canada. You can find past episodes and additional content at the website, which is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. That's letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. You can also find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest for extra daily content. I've recently changed the username to better reflect the focus on mental health and to make it easier for new people to identify what Let's Talk About Mental Health is all about. So the new username is @LTAMentalHealth. That's @LTAMentalHealth on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself, and as always, make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care, and talk to you next time.